Hello, and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Understanding Trust in Civil Society. My name is Dan Cardinale, President and CEO at Independent Sector. We are so thrilled you are here with us today to talk about a critical subject for civil society, and especially right now in the middle of a crisis, namely trust. Today, I'm honored to be joined by John Edelman, Managing Director of Global Engagement and Corporate Responsibility at Edelman. Edelman is a communications and research firm that has been measuring trust around the world for 2 decades. After the discussion with John, I'll be joined by my colleagues in the sector for a discussion on what this all means for the sector we are all working in every day. The panel includes Jennifer Reedy, President at the Bush Foundation, Stacy Stewart, President and CEO at the March of Dimes, and Kathy Rich, Director, Building Institutions and Networks at the Ford Foundation. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that you are on mute. So 2 things. 1, if you want to put who you are and where you're from in the chat function, we always love to see who you are, and it creates a sense of community among all of us on the webinar. And then if you have a question, we hope you do, there'll be time at the end, please put that in the Q&A box. We are going to be recording this, and it will be made available on our website and will be sent to you by email. And one request, please do take the survey at the end of this session. We use that information to better curate the material it's really helpful to you all. So let's get started. Independent Sector released this report on trust on June 25th. But Edelman Intelligence conducted the survey with the American public in late 2019 and early 2020, before COVID hit. It is the largest sample size Edelman has done on trust for US-based nonprofits, and it is the only report that gives a look into what drives trust. This trust work will also be part of a larger effort, a new report by Independent Sector on the health of the sector, which we'll be releasing in September, so look for it then. Now, let's turn to the data that we found in the report. The first thing I want to highlight is that there is good news, that really, 4 out of 5 Americans have a high degree of trust for nonprofits, and 2/3 of Americans hold philanthropy as a place they have confidence. So the good news is the American public really does look to the sector as a trusted entity. There is, however, some interesting news. When asked, do you trust nonprofits and philanthropy to do right, we found that almost 2/3 of Americans really believe that nonprofits will do right. So you go to the next slide, you'll see that 59% of Americans hold nonprofits as really doing what's right for society, where there's a fairly large disparity that only about 1 in 3 Americans hold philanthropy is doing right. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that disparity later on. On the next slide, you'll see that we asked the general population what they saw their preferred role for nonprofits. Overwhelmingly, we see that the American public expects nonprofits to really serve the less fortunate. This is powerful information and leads to what will drive trust in a discussion a little bit later. And then not fairly far behind, but still an important data point, is that the American public looks to nonprofits to be advocates for change. So our experience in working with the less fortunate seems to be driving expectations that we then advocate for change in America. And then we were very, very interested in diving into, when someone trusted the sector, kind of who were they? What kind of background did they come from? And when folks had a distrust for the sector, who were they? So if you look in this next slide, it's quite powerful. Those we call trusters tend to be college educated. They have household incomes at $75,000 or greater. They live in urban and suburban communities. They pay a fairly close attention to the national politics and follow the news. They tend to be more democratic, and they live in the Northeast. Those who are distrusters, those folks who have a low degree of trust in the sector, tend to be less well educated. They earn less than $35,000 a year. They live in rural communities. They don't tend to follow politics. They tend to be more Republican. And this is an important data point. They are less familiar with philanthropy. So this is important top-line data. I would commend the report to you all. Please take a look at it. It's full of data. But now I'd like to turn to a discussion with John, who's been doing this for a long time. So John, we released this report, Trust in Civil Society, on June 25th. But the surveys were conducted prior to COVID-19. But you have 20 years of experience in measuring trust across sectors and industries. What, if anything, either surprised you or helped reinforce what you knew about trust in the sector?
This is a very interesting survey. It sort of reflects, we did our annual Trust Barometer back in January that we came out in January 2020. And what we found out in all four institutions that we trust, that we survey, nonprofits, business and government, and NGOs similarly were less trusted by the Vox Populi, the same parameter of your survey that came out in June. But this pessimism was also similar in business and government as well. The gap in trust is across all institutions. And so the result of this pessimism is there's a loss of trust in institutions. There's fears with the economic uncertainty and job insecurity that trust is a big gap. And so so in response to this lack of trust in institutions, we see what's happening in the public square where students are advocating on climate change, employees are protesting at companies for higher wages, better safe working conditions, fair working conditions, and now more recently, we've seen more of the social justice protests that have continued for the past several weeks. So this big vacuum of trust provides great opportunity, but it's reflected in the public actions that people are taking. And so this is an interesting summary of what our trust, but it's sort of reflected what your specific trust barometer related to your independent sector demonstrated as well.
So if I may sum it up a little bit, those at the bottom of the pyramid who are not really in the flow of being able to take advantage of the kind of benefits that are accrued to those who are more affluent are really frustrated. And we're seeing that being manifested in this kind of civic action that's taking place right now across the U.S. Is that a fair way to
well, I think it's less trust in all institutions, and that as a result, because there's less trust in NGOs, business, and government, that people are taking action in their own hands. Employees are leaving companies and saying we want higher wages or fair working conditions, better treatment of women. So, and then obviously most recently this social justice and after the George Floyd, it's happening week after week, these protests. So there's people want action and they're voting with their feet literally, in terms of walking and really a huge, uproar and people are taking action by walking out and protesting and the like.
Yeah, that's great. So John, one thing that we're proud of in the report that Independent Sector has issued is it doesn't just measure trust levels, but it also helps diagnosing for institutions the reasons behind either high or low trust and allows us as leaders of these institutions to do something about that. So I'd love to get from you some of your experience on over the years, what has driven trust. And there is a particularly fascinating difference in, I know the research you've been doing, between ethics and competence as diminishments of trust in 2020 in the Trust Barometer. So I think there's some slides that we're going to play.
Yeah, if you would go to the slides, the first slide. We've been doing this Trust Barometer, I think it's the next one. We've been doing the Trust Barometer for 20 years, and we're asking our institutions, how much faith do you have in institutions? And so this year we took it a little bit further to try to drive down into more, detail about what are the components of trust. And we came up with these four, integrity, purpose, and dependability relate to the ethical components of trust. And competence is basically the ability to get the job done. what was very interesting in this year's deeper dive of the survey was that the ethical aspects, integrity, dependability, and purpose, are 3 times more significant in building trust than the competence. That was quite a very interesting finding, and it speaks to what we'll talk about later about what NGOs can do to emphasize this ethics component on integrity, dependability, and purpose. And if you could go into the next slide, I'll go into more detail. What this also shows is that, as I said earlier, we talk about competence and the ethical components. What this slide shows here is that none of the 4 institutions, business, media, government, NGOs, are both competent and ethical. But NGOs look strong in terms of the ethical, and it highlights, that there's good intention, but they haven't. The survey shows that they haven't seen the impact in the communities, making the difference on the environmental and civil rights issues that they're focused on. So this was very interesting that of all the 4 institutions, none were both trusted both for their ethics and the competence. But then the reemphasis on the ethics are the more important things to building trust for the long haul. That you're purpose-driven, you're honest, and you have vision. And we'll talk more about that in the conversation. But this was really, really significant finding in this deeper dive about what makes trust and how you build it for the future.
So I have to say, from someone who's been in the nonprofit sector for over 30 years, and particularly having led an organization prior to coming to independent sector that built its reputation on being highly effective, I find this data very important to pay attention to, that really how you proceed, the kind of dependability, the clarity will really be powerful drivers for then folks to trust that you are driving in the impact that you're leading with. But if you lead with impact, there's a probability that they may not trust you, in the sense the ends don't justify the means. The how you proceed is as important as what you get accomplished. Is that a fair summary of kind of what a nonprofit leader should be paying attention to here?
Well, I mean, I would agree. I think that you just assume competence is, that everybody has the ability to do what they're supposed to do. But it's very fascinating that your dependability, your integrity, and your purpose are 3 times more impactful. And that's a good lesson learned, because that's reflective of NGOs as well as other entities, that you really have to emphasize your ethical aspects. Competence is, a given, but to really build trust and build the relationship, you really have to come across in terms of your ethical aspects. That makes sense in terms of if there's a lack of trust, generally, you have to go beyond competence and really build on purpose and ethics and transparency and accountability to really drive home what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, powerful. So we know, COVID-19 is an international pandemic that none of us have seen in our lifetime. But you've already done some work on what the coronavirus and resulting economic crisis will do to trust in the nonprofit in this.
Yes, I think can you hear me okay still?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I thought I was okay. So yes, so because of the significance of COVID, we did an April COVID study of trust and institutions, and what was very fascinating, what the survey reported, again, it was of the 4 institutions and how people are seeing the institutions and dealing with the COVID. So what was very relevant is that across all 4 institutions, trust is improved, but across NGOs in 8 of the 11 markets that we surveyed, trust in NGOs had risen. Similarly, we also saw a rise in the trust in government, except, in 7 of the 11 countries. The countries that did not have as strong trust were U.S., Germany, no, excuse me, U.S., France, and Japan. So that's really relevant. And so what that sort of shared is that there's an expectation, that that companies have to do, that institutions have to do better. And one of the very important pieces of this, that in this survey, is that of those surveyed, 4 in 10, when asked about the NGOs, even though their trust has risen, 4 of 10 think they still weren't being effective in bringing, impact to the local community, raising funds, for the organizations, helping people with financial hardship. So even though, the trust has risen, there's the question of, is this a trust bubble? Is the trust in institutions going to be able to sustain? Are trust in NGOs going to be able to sustain themselves once the COVID and the emergency is passed? It doesn't clear like it's not going to be passed for a while, but it's sort of a call to action that, there is this rise in trust, but at the same time, is it going to be sustainable? And sort of that's a calling out, what can NGOs do to capitalize on this trust and be sustainable going forward? But even, in this environment of trust bubble, even, as I said, 4 of 10 respondents still felt that NGOs weren't doing enough in terms of reaching people that are having their hard financial hardships, raising the money, and getting the programs into the local communities. So that was sort of like opportunity, but still opportunity to grow and capitalize on this moment of trust to make it sustainable going forward.
Yeah. So we saw this kind of important data point that the trust report that Independent Sector did with you all really demonstrated that when folks were working with underserved communities and advocating for change to better those communities, it was a driver to foster trust, which was very, very powerful. It sounds like there's some important learning, and I'd love for you to reflect, what should leaders of nonprofits do to really build trust at this, particularly at this very tender time in our country and in the world?
Great. Yeah, I think the Independent Sector survey had really clearly defined, roles and responsibilities. And, the first is, that they expect you have to be clear about your mission and purpose. Second, you have to be transparent and work and show integrity and be open about your funding sources and who the money goes to. And third, you have to talk about outcomes and impacts. So those 3 things are key. I think it came out in this Independent Sector survey clearly that it's key that you address those 3, and these actions must be undertaken, to sustain and grow the trust opportunity that's here. And, as we pointed out, there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of good news, but also there's really a clear call to action, to keep doing what you're doing, but do it better, as we've talked about.
Yeah. I often wonder, before we sign off, in our pre-conversation, going back to this point about the integrity with which we proceed, if we need as a sector to slow down a little bit and ensure that we're connected to those that are struggling, and from that experience, then develop new strategies for impact, kind of based on what you're observing. Does that make sense? And because I think we live in a culture, right, where producing and making differences and driving outcomes, there's real pressure for your ROI as a nonprofit. But it feels like we're being asked to show up a little bit differently based on really putting trust as an outcome that is critical to doing everything else. I'm curious about your reflections.
I think you're right. I think, that the ethical component, integrity, dependability, purpose, are really key. I mean, competence, you just assume, the nonprofits have been around and they know their customers, they know their communities, but what is really coming out is the importance of really focusing on the this integrity, this transparency, all the things that we've referenced, because, the ethical component is really, the key to drive and build trust. And we see, an opportunity to work with you on a multi-year journey to sort of work collectively in this, because I think the opportunity is now, and the expectation is great. And there's the NGOs and have been serving this important role for many years in what they've been doing, but now the opportunity is even stronger to really build, trust for the future by really, highlighting on these ethical things. And competence is good, but you really have to nail the ethical pieces, because people are looking for trusted institutions to drive change. And we know from what we've talked about that, there's a lack of trust and pessimism, and it's a real opportunity for nonprofits and independent sector organizations sort of take the leadership opportunity that's available to it and really drive it.
Great. Well, John, I want to thank you for joining us today. And most importantly, I want to thank you and your really extraordinary colleagues for the kind of partnership, the 20 years of deep and really kind of unique global experience being brought to bear for nonprofit leaders to really step into this incredibly important work of fostering trust and helping really American society navigate these super difficult times. So any parting words for us before we switch to our panel?
Well, I just thank you for the opportunity. We appreciate the opportunity to work with you on this research, and we look forward to working further with you, because, as I say, the opportunity is great, to already build on what you have and build trust for the long haul, because what's happening here seems like it's going to be around for a while longer and beyond, and there's a real opportunity for sector organizations to really be leaders in partnership. So thank you for the time, and appreciate you including me in this very important conversation.
Oh, thank you. And we look forward to working in the future and continue this conversation. With that, I'd like to turn to our three panelists, Stacy, Kathy, and Jen. Ask you to just having listened to this, having read the report, just briefly introduce yourself, and I'd love just your kind of opening interpretation, kind of what really grabbed you. And so I'm going to go on the order on my screen, and Stacy, you're in my upper left-hand corner.
Great. Well, Dan, thanks so much, and it's great to be with Kathy and Jen. I thought the Edelman study was so interesting and fascinating. I'm the president and CEO of the March of Dimes, and have been in multiple sectors actually, and been leading a nonprofit for a number of years, and been in this position with the March of Dimes for a little over 3 years before I was U.S. president for United Way, where we spent a lot of time looking at the issue of trust for sure, and working with Edelman. Have run the Fannie Mae Foundation and been a leader in philanthropy, and also was in the private sector for a period of time. So I kind of look at this report as sort of fascinating, especially when you look at all the sectors and how all the sectors are not seen very favorably. But I'm glad to see that nonprofits, at least on the ethical measures, were doing a little bit better, meaning that we have maybe, and as John mentioned, a real opportunity to build on that. And I think this is an important moment. I think that, what's going on in the country right now is there's so much unrest, so much, chaos really in many communities. I know a lot of people feel so much uncertainty. I think now is the time for us to seize as a sector on what we can do to actually build on that level of trust that exists, expand it, really improve it, but also do it in a way that feels really impactful for the people that we're trying to serve. So I'm pleased to be on for this conversation.
That's great. Thank you. Just to remind our audience, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. We will have a conversation for about 20 minutes and then open it up for folks. Kathy, love to get your brief intro, but your kind of initial take on this. We've been doing this for a while.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Rich, and I direct the BUILD program, Building Institutions and Networks at the Ford Foundation. Currently working with about 330 organizations in 32 different countries to strengthen them for the long-term fight against inequality. I will say that I read this report grateful that of the 4 sectors, I guess people trust us more than government and the private sector and the media. But I didn't see a whole lot of good news in this report, and I think that there are some real warnings for us as a sector in nonprofits and especially in philanthropy about what we need to be doing differently to really increase trust for the people that we are all here to serve.
Great. We will be picking up on that in a minute. And Jen, please introduce yourself and your kind of opening kind of take on this report.
Yeah, so I'm Jen Ford-Reedy with the Bush Foundation, which is a private charitable foundation based in Minnesota. So I am representing the part of the field that had the lowest scores, the least trust, and actually pretty dramatically different actually than how nonprofits in general scored in the survey, which is very understandable to me. I can see why that happened. I think there's a lot for us to reckon with as a field. But I think it's a reflection both of a lot of giant social trends happening and what foundations represent, with a lot of changes in the world, as well as a lot of our own practices that we could be changing and assumptions we've made about what is actually a good and virtuous thing to do as a foundation, that may have over time actually made us more remote, less engaged, and lower levels of trust, I think, as the report clearly shows.
That's great. So let's actually dive into that first. The disparity, right, between nonprofits which enjoy a fairly strong trust and philanthropy which it doesn't as much. You call that out, but I think you and your work have really tried to get at this in how you proceed. So I'd love for you to kind of dig into that. What do you think some of the causes for that are, and what are you learning in your own work leading a foundation that's place-based?
I think some of the causes, like I said, are big. And when you look at the history of foundations, I mean, from the very beginning, when Rockefeller tried to get his foundation chartered, the Congress wouldn't do it. They thought the idea of having a foundation seemed fundamentally undemocratic. And I used to tell that anecdote as sort of like a, can you believe people used to think that? Because we really had this long period of everyone just thinking foundations were good guys, right? I mean, we brought you Sesame Street. You know, we are just benevolent institutions. And I think we're having more of that sentiment actually that was like in Rockefeller's time. And there are ways in which our moment is like that moment. And a few of those, I mean, one, income inequality, is really dramatic right now. And I think, you know, in order for a private foundation to exist, someone has to have made so much money that they need to hire people to give it away, right? I mean, that is a demonstration of income inequality. I think we have more active living donors, which I think matters a lot, because it's one thing just to think it's an institution that's doing things. It's another thing to think, wait, Bill Gates is messing with education? You know, the more it's personified, the more it's George Soros, the more it's the Koch brothers, the less people think that makes sense, that someone would be able to have that much power. And I think people react to that. And I think actually the more we get engaged on policy issues, which for a lot of us, we feel like is an impact driver, I think there's some trust risks, because again, it's saying, wait, who are these institutions that are having that much say in political process, and do we really trust them to do that? I think there's also just general questioning and re-examining of the role of government. And if you think the government should be doing a lot more than it is right now, then things where it used to be when philanthropy did it, you say, isn't that nice that philanthropy is doing that? Right now you say, this is a fundamental part of the problem, that philanthropy is doing this as opposed to the government doing it. So I think there are a lot of really big questions and issues going on in our society right now. And foundations represent some of the things that people are concerned about or find problematic in society.
Yeah. So I'm going to pick up this, and Kathy, pivot to you. You in your work have a global purview on what's going on. And in our prep call, I think you called out something really powerful. And the data, kind of goes at something that Jen just mentioned, that the most trusted group of individuals, if you're going to put that, are people that are known in their community, the common person. And then there's a big drop off, and government and nonprofits come in behind that. So institutions in general are less trusted, and people do want to trust the people that they live with and are engaged. You're looking out across the whole world. You've flagged a number of things. What is grabbing your attention? What should we learn globally? And what might be some of the strategies we could deploy as leaders of both philanthropic and nonprofit organizations?
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks to all the panelists. This has already been a fascinating discussion this afternoon. I do think this report is a warning sign for all of us, because when I read it, I don't interpret the results.
You just went on mute, Kathy.
Sorry,
There you go.
there we go.
No worries.
When I read it, I don't interpret the results solely as a reflection of where nonprofits and especially philanthropy are falling short. Don't get me wrong, I don't think there's any doubt at all, especially in the philanthropy sector, that we need to work a lot harder to ensure that we're reflective of and accountable to the people and the communities that we serve. But I think we also have to realize and acknowledge that around the world, civil society is also being actively delegitimized. It's a global phenomenon. According to Civicus, in 2018, only 22 countries around the world enabled and safeguarded the enjoyment of civic space for all people. And that this trend is unfolding across a wide range of governments, including democracies, including here in the United States. In many contexts, there's a growing public narrative that we in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors are self-appointed rather than representative, that we're political actors in disguise, that we're an elite that's out of touch with the needs of real people. And we have to counter that, right? We have to address that public narrative head on. I think the best way to not be an easy target here is to be seen as a tangible and relevant public good. And you're so right, Dan, that this can't be achieved in the abstract. People have to live it in order to understand our sector's relevance and to care about our sector, which means that nonprofits and philanthropy have to be front and center in bringing about real and measurable change in people's lives, whether that's providing essential safety net services during a time of COVID, or whether it's really by stepping up and leading on some of these very difficult conversations that we're now having in our country about systemic racism. I think we also have to make sure on the nonprofit and philanthropic side that our leadership and our boards really reflect the diversity of the people that we serve. And we have to take concrete steps to ensure that our work is driven by their impact and their input and their feedback. We need to be transparent and we need to be accountable. I think that every time a nonprofit or a foundation does ethical, high quality, empathetic, and impactful work, every time that we lift up a community instead of talking down to it, we increase trust and we prove our own legitimacy. And finally, I do think that we need to do a much better job of banding together than we have in the past. We need to align our efforts and we need to make more of an effort to speak with a common voice, because there are safety and power in our numbers, right? We're more than 10% of the GDP in the United States, right? Just one striking recent example of this for me is the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, which is being led by a diverse coalition of a number of organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, Color of Change, Common Sense Media, the NAACP, to try to end hate speech on public platforms. And sure, any one of these amazing organizations could have launched the Stop Hate for Profit campaign, but it's having a dramatic effect precisely because they're joining forces and they're working on it together. And I think that's why organizations like Independent Sector are so important, Dan, because you provide the connective tissue that allows our sector to organize and advocate for itself.
Thanks, Kathy. Powerful. I think I have to say it is a little alarming to know that we're, just like the pandemic, caught in kind of a global pressure where the spaces for civil society, the forces are actually shrinking. So there's the work with our community, and then there's the equal work about building trust as a sector with ourselves in order to push against those forces. So I'd love to just pin that and come back to it, because I think sometimes we lose sight. We get caught in the internal kind of machinations of our own world. Stacy, so you have, as you mentioned at the beginning, this wonderful range of experiences, but my experience of you, and I've known you for many years, is you have, with very large legacy organizations, really worked exceedingly hard at becoming, much the way Kathy described, grounded in community, connected to the people that you're intending to serve, and allowing them to drive their voice forward while also harnessing the institution itself. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think about building trust as a nonprofit leader.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I have to say, I think I've formed this over the period of time, even beyond just being at the March of Dimes, really at United Way, and certainly now at the March of Dimes. And when I think about this idea of trust building, I think about two big points. And I know there are a lot of other points about purpose-driven and things like that on the slide. I also think about it in two ways. One is, are we as a nonprofit doing the work that is reflective of what the community says are their priorities? So in other words, as the leader of this organization, the March of Dimes, am I working on the things that I believe are important, and am I carrying out, and is the institution carrying out its own internally driven agenda towards a community, or are we actually listening to the community and then bringing those priorities into our organization to help develop and form our strategy and our approach? And that's been really important. And there, Dan, you know that a lot of this comes from a Harwood way of thinking about things that I've adopted in my own thinking, because I think it's really important. So that idea of really reflecting what the community believes is important, I think is really important. And for the March of Dimes, that's really important. You know, we work on the issue of maternal and infant health. And when you look at the data, and when you look in and listen to the stories and what a lot of people are talking about, it hasn't been an issue that has actually risen to the top of the priority of things that we're working on in this country, unfortunately, although that has changed pretty dramatically in the last few years when you've seen big voices of folks like Beyonce and Serena telling their stories, and that's really important. But now we're starting to hear everyday women telling their stories. And when we start to reflect those stories in our own work and talk about how those stories are now changing how the March of Dimes is moving forward, I think that's been an important way for us to not only be more effective, frankly, but to engage communities and build that trust, because frankly, we can't do this work alone. I mean, one of the things that I've felt really important is that, you know, if we're going to do this work, we have to do it with others. And so the idea of building trust within the sector with others, Dan, is really important, because we can't take on sort of a savior complex as an organization. We have to believe that we are a part of an interwoven network of people and communities and institutions that need to all be working together. And to the extent that we can help forge that, it's really important. The other part, though, of trust is really, I think, you know, for me, I'm the first African American to lead this organization in over 80 years. And an organization started by President Roosevelt. You know, we have a history, actually, and it was interesting when I started this organization, I read up even more on the history and in a lot more depth, and found that we were doing things that were actually deeply rooted in equity and health equity many, many years ago with the polio crisis. And it really warmed my heart to know that there were some things that we were doing, and a lot of things in terms of partnering with Tuskegee Institute in Alabama and making sure that the polio vaccine will be available to all people of color, as well as white people, especially during the time of segregation. But I also know that just me as an African American isn't enough to ensure that that trust with the African American community is there. We have to actually, it can't just be me and a person that automatically checks the box. It's got to be that we have to be authentic in our work, and we have to actually do what we say we're going to do, which is the second big part of trust for me, is reflect the community's concerns. But then integrity really is, if you say you want to actually close the racial equity gap, if you say you want to actually, for us, lower and actually eliminate the maternal mortality and infant mortality gaps that exist, we actually have to do things that are going to lead to that outcome and be able to hold ourselves accountable for that. And that level of transparency, I think that John talked about, is really important. And that's a big burden on me as an African American or whoever is in this position, right? And that's got to be at the core of what we wake up every day and worry and think about. At the March of Nines, that certainly has been, how I've seen the role and how I see the role of nonprofit leadership in general.
So all of you have talked about a tension point. I'd love for you just to reflect, each of you, on this. Between, all of you represent, large, multi-decade, in some cases, sometimes much longer, institutions that are repositories of real wisdom, of learning, of research. You also have all three struggled as institutions and innovated around how to be attentive and prompted by community. What are the strategies for bridging that tension between, in a sense, the academy, the wisdom, the hard-won research? Data matters. None of us would send our child to a doctor that didn't have credentials and had gone to school and had, write a prescription that didn't trust that there was real rigor behind the medicine that was being prescribed. And yet at the same time, this powerful commitment to agency and community and being prompted and sharing power. How do you think about threading that needle and holding the dynamism of, to Jen's point, in a sense, there's a kind of, we've aggregated wisdom in large institutions. How do you share that? So open it up to any one of you, but I'd love for all three of you to comment because you bring different purviews.
Well,
I'm happy to talk about that. Do you want to go ahead, Stacey?
No, go ahead. I'll follow you.
Stacey,
well,
you're
I
off
think,
mute. So
it's come up a couple times already. Who are the people in your organization matters a lot, right? So who's on your board, who's on your staff, who do you engage in other ways? So, for example, we have advisory committees, and for our flagship programs, grantees or fellows are actually selected by community leaders. So it's sort of who do you actually directly bring in to be a part of the work, I think matters a lot, which is, like I said, a theme that's come up a couple of times. One thing that I think is particularly important, so I've put a lot of emphasis on, is how do people get ideas considered? So how can we be permeable as an institution? So for me, it's really important that we have open processes for someone to be able to say, hey, here's my idea, and have a way that someone can get that considered. And beyond that, we go out into communities to do office hours, to go around our region, go to Western North Dakota, or go to South Dakota on the reservation to say, here we are for the day. Anyone who wants to come talk to us, please come talk to us and tell us your ideas. And we have hotlines, so anyone can call to talk to somebody live about their idea. We do feedback calls if they are not accepted, so that then there's actually some conversation back. They're not necessarily happy with what they hear from us, but they're happy at least that they had that interaction and that there was some more real human interaction around a grant than just, you apply into an institution and get an answer from this black box and you don't really know what happened. But I think there's a lot more we can be doing, like we have a sense of our next frontier. But for us, designing things so that we are exposed to as many ideas and people as possible, and then have the systems in place to be able to truly get behind and support other people's ideas and not our own ideas, to me is pretty fundamental for how we approach that at the Bush Foundation.
So I assume you will have had to have blown up a little bit of a traditional program officer having a portfolio of grantees, and now asking program officers and your own whole institution to your point about permeability, to make sense of what is coming in, and this openness to being surprised or being pushed in ways that your theory of change might not have accounted for.
That's right. And it's a skill. I mean, it takes a lot of work to have the skill set to be able to understand everybody's context, to be able to say, does this idea actually make sense given what this community is, what the issue is, how people are thinking about it? Does this actually make sense as an approach for us to get behind? It's a very different skill set than saying, we know an issue.
Yeah.
We know an issue and we know what are good strategies for that issue and we're going to fund that. It's a very, very different mindset and skill set for staff.
Wow. So I want to pin that. Stacy, Kathy, thoughts on this, kind of gap that can exist between institutions and community?
Yeah, I think it's, I just wanted to add and just pick up on Jen's point, which I thought was really, really great. I think, it's, this work is really, it's in part science and in part art, right? I mean, we have to recognize that, we at the March Times fund a ton of research. We're very science driven, very evidence driven. But when we're trying to move the needle on community outcomes, just trying to ram the science down people's throat without understanding how they see that, how they receive that information, their skepticism of it. I mean, when we're working, for example, in the African American community, we can't ignore the fact that the Tuskegee experiment existed and that there's a huge amount of distrust in by people of color with the medical community. We know, for example, that it's super important for everybody to get prenatal visits, but if the actual experience of Black and brown women going to health clinics is that there's a significant amount of implicit bias within the clinics, and those women don't feel welcomed and they don't feel well received. It doesn't matter how much we try to promote prenatal visits if what plays out on the ground doesn't match the experience that makes it even accessible for those women to get the kind of help that they need. So for us, we have to understand the science. We have to also meet people where they are, meet communities where they are, and recognize that that we will have to spend time helping people understand it and feel comfortable with what we know to be in a lot of folks' best interest based on science, but also be willing to adjust how those things get delivered or how they get implemented in the community based on the community's receptivity to it. And that those are just realities that we have to be respectful of and listen to. Again, it goes back to being able to listen and encourage and invite those perspectives in so that we understand as an organization what we can do to actually get folks the help that they need, but in the ways that they're willing to receive it and respond to it.
Yeah,
Someone has a question.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Kathy. No, I'll come circle back. Go.
Okay, yeah, just 3 quick things. And I should say, Ford Foundation is not the paragon of listening deeply to individuals and communities close to the ground, right? It's hard for us to do that, although we're trying to get a lot better. But 3 pieces of advice. One is to really share power, especially at the board level. So for a foundation, that means having nonprofit and community leaders on your board and not just 1 or 2, like half or more, right? A second would be getting Proximate, which Ford's trustee, Bryan Stevenson from Equal Justice Initiative talks about. Really get into communities and really listen to people. And if you don't know how and you're not well positioned to do that, if you're a big national organization, partner with the smaller organizations on the ground who do know how to link to communities and learn with them. But that leads to the third thing is you've got to be sure you're willing to pay for it. I feel like so much of what we do in national nonprofits and in philanthropy can feel extractive to people. So if you're going to ask people what they think, if you're going to ask them to participate in your processes to get their input and feedback, pay them what that is worth. Provide childcare to them so that they can actually take time off to come and do it with you. So I think that it's not enough to just say our doors are open. You actually have to really enable people and support them to walk through those doors.
So all of you have hinted directly or around, I think, a tension point. Let me just see if I can name it. That institutions, the way nonprofits, whether they're philanthropic or let's say not so much the local but regional and national, are built, is they tended to preference smarts, expertise, degrees, the ability to know the right answer, the learning. And there's a journey now in Jen, I thought, put it very powerfully, the kind of a whole new set of skills. Stacy laid out this notion of how do you translate science and community, and Kathy just gave 3 very concrete ways of actually changing your institutions. How much resistance have you all met in bridging this? And is there and Jen, I know a little bit because we've talked, what does it mean to go to an institution and say, by the way, we're going to ask you, Stacey, I'll put a fine point on it. We're going to ask you to be as good at community engagement as you are in science. Like that, we haven't But like, so talk about the messiness. I mean, this is hard work. So what's not gone well? What have you learned? What would you recommend? Any one of you?
Yeah, I'll start with just, I think what we're talking about for a lot of our organizations is a definite culture change. As we really look at these ways to both, be very impactful and evidence-based, and then also very community engaged and listening organizations. I would pick up on Kathy's point. I think it definitely means changes that are pretty significant on a few levels. One is, I think it does mean that you've got to have a board and a staff that is reflective of the communities that you're trying to serve. And I also think it goes even further, which is, it also means that you may have to incorporate different skill sets and talent sets into the organization, right?
Competencies.
The folks that were used to operating in a certain kind of way, you may need a different set of people and leaders within the organization to move in that direction, and be then focus on how that really influences the kind of culture change that we all need to put in place in order to support that. Because frankly, a lot of people, if they haven't grown up thinking about that level of community engagement, they're not necessarily very open to it, or they just don't know how to do it. And it's really a culture that's built up about it. But it has to start, if it's about culture change as well, with the top. In other words, the board and leadership have to say, if this is how we're going to succeed as an organization, if this is how we're going to actually become more impactful, build our trust, we have to actually change as an organization. And that takes time too. That's not that you don't flip a switch on that. It just takes time and consistency of message. But again, that goes to what people, I think, were saying, is they want to know that the leaders of these organizations are really committed and are saying the things and then following through on the actions that reflect what they say they're really about. And that, I think, is at the core of what we're really talking about.
Super.
I definitely agree. I'd also say that community is not simple. And, we're 3 organizations that work across lots of communities. And so sometimes you have that, we should ask community this, we should ask community that. And that's not a simple thing to do, and figuring out what does that mean, on any particular thing we're talking about, what does it mean to engage the community? So it's not always it requires real strategy and in some ways infrastructure to be able to actually regularly, deeply be engaged with community beyond the organization. I think another thing I'd say from a philanthropic standpoint is that it's so deep in so many people's beliefs about philanthropy that to have an impact, you have to focus. And so to me, that's a challenge in doing work that's really truly with community, is that it's so, people have that so deep in them that part of the value we add is identifying that issue and going after that issue and getting people aligned around that issue. And I feel like, the odds of a huge, amazing social change happening are not that great at any time in any area. And the idea that we're always saying, we're going to hit it right there. This is the exact change we're going to see. And then we're going to go after that change, as opposed to saying, we're going to know how to look for where change is possible. And we're going to be able to identify when things are really lining up and something really big could happen there. And then we're going to go in and help. But it's hard to shift people's brains that way. I think because a lot of our sense of strategy we import from business strategy. But there's this very, very deep, it's in the gut sense that, to be so open to ideas means you're not actually being strategic. And so that's something to fight a little bit.
All right, so 2 things, and then Kathy. So Stacy calls out culture and a kind of competency, and also a patience for org change. Jen then builds on that and says, not only that, but beware, my words, not yours, overly strategic philanthropy that drives towards you being the agent of change as opposed to partnering with community, identifying with community where change is emerging, and then enabling that to be the driver. Kathy.
So I think that so much of this question of, why it is hard for institutions to do this comes down to the theme of this conversation, which is trust. We don't actually trust people outside our walls to help us make good decisions, right? I think that so much of this is about trust and control, and the fact that all of us have worked very hard, and many of us have fancy educations and all of that to get to where we are, and we think that we're supposed to know, right? We're supposed to be the experts, and so we're supposed to come up with the great solutions, and then we're supposed to impose them, and people are supposed to thank us for that. I think what we need to do is let go of the notion, first of all, that there is much of anything within our control when it comes to social change, as Jen says, and also to let go of the notion that we are quote unquote experts who are supposed to know all the answers. In fact, our answers are going to be richer the more people that we get information from, and the more people that we really listen deeply to. And so I think that we do have to cede some power. There are lots of discussions these days about how people in elite institutions need to cede power, and now is the time to be very real and authentic about actually doing that.
That's great. So we're coming out on time. I'm curious, I'd love for each of you to kind of have some closing remarks or something that is a nugget for you in either learning or if you take it from the report. But let me ask one last question before I do that. Let's just talk about power sharing. Each of you have talked about it. I'd love in your own life, in your work, if there is a either really good example of where it's worked that folks could learn from, or the opposite, like thought, best intention, no moral judgment, but what didn't work and why? Because I think this is one of the big challenges of us today, right? There's a pandemic going on. We're in this racial reckoning. We've yet to fully see the economic impact. Nonprofits are going to be both caught in that and turned to as a unique force to help navigate it. Trust, we know, is going to be critical for folks to feel like they can lean into those institutions. And we've all identified power sharing as a really powerful way to get the right answers and the collective action. You can talk out loud. This was a question I know that you didn't have ahead of time, but it's coming.
Since I named it, I guess I'll start. At the Ford Foundation, the program that I run gives 5-year, multi-year grants, and they're 5-year, highly flexible grants, right? They're a combination of completely unrestricted support and then support that is still very flexible, but intended for organizations to strengthen themselves for the long term, strategically, leadership, financially. So in that, I have held a lot of hands at the Ford Foundation in giving up control. There are no deliverables in a build grant, right? There are some outcomes and indicators, but they're really light and they're very subject to change. And there is an enormous amount of trust that if you give millions of dollars to an organization, that over the 5 years, they'll do some great things, even though we don't necessarily know what those things are. It's been an incredible experience at Ford because in almost every case, the organizations have used this money extremely well and brought about change we couldn't have foreseen when we made the grants, or remained stable and held the line during incredibly tumultuous times and under very difficult operating conditions. Look, there's always a downside in that. And I think the biggest downside I hear is, how do we know if we're making a difference if we do that, right? How do we know that our work is actually making a difference? It does require a bit of a leap of faith. What it requires is trust. Trust is very much a two-way street, right? And I would say that in the cases where it hasn't worked, most of those cases they've been pretty rare, and they've boiled down to cases where the money wasn't managed in a prudent way. And so I do think, and this goes to ethics and that element of trust that John talked about earlier, I think that nonprofits and foundations do need to keep their fiscal houses well in order first and foremost, because there is that basic level of, can you handle money and do you know what you're doing with it? That's sort of a prerequisite to us being able to be either trustworthy or effective.
Yeah, That's great. Jen, Stacy.
I was just going to say that, and I know we're short on time, so I just quickly, I would say, you know, when we look at the issues we're working on around maternal and infant health, one of the things that we did as we built our strategies, we tried to be really clear what lane we're in, because there are a lot of different players, and a lot of players bring a lot more to the table than we ever could or even should try to, right? So we made a decision that there were a few lanes of leadership that we could be really good at, and where we thought the sector and the cause really needed us, and decided that there were others that were better at doing other parts of it. As an example, just quickly, ACOG is the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. They really bring a medical point of view to the work. We're clear, we're not a medical organization. We're more of a public health organization, relying on medical advice and trying to reach and drive population level change, right? I hate to call out ACOG specifically, but they're a great partner of ours. But that's just an example of how, when you look at a cause and a big issue, I think for us, part of the trust is building relationships with organizations with the clarity of what we intend and feel like we can be good at and what others can rely on us for, and being able to stay in that lane so that we don't create confusion and really break the trust because people are not clear on where we're going and what we're intending to do. And that actually has been really helpful to just have that level of clarity. And it's actually I think it's helped build stronger relationships across the sector. And then with people that are supporting us, be able for us to articulate to our donors and others what they can expect from us as well.
Great. So know your partners and build trust by being good at what you do and really enabling them to be great at what they do.
Absolutely.
Super. Jen, bring us home.
Well, at least one thing that I think is additive to what these guys already said that I think was right on is part of whether we're showing trust is in how we communicate and what we expect of each other. And we expect a whole lot from grantees in terms of them showing us that they're making a difference. We do not share with the world the same kind of information about whether we are doing a good job. And I think foundations have not actually shared much. And in part, there's been something about, oh, we don't want to make it about us. It's about our grantees. They're the ones doing the work. So there's something maybe nice in there. But the result is we're not giving much out there for people to really be able to hold us accountable. And so we've been really trying to look at ourselves and say, how could somebody tell if we're doing a good job? How can we tell if we're doing a really good job? And how do we present data out to grantees at the same level of rigor and expectation that we are expecting others to show that they're making an impact?
That's great. Not surprising, we're over time. So I just want to stop, go to the balcony and thank Jen, Kathy, Stacy for just a super thoughtful conversation. This is the first of many, we hope. In a week from Tuesday on the 14th, we'll have an Upswell pop-up that will take a deeper dive into this. And I have to give a shout out in terms of just an impressive trust builder, Lema Gaboui, who the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the woman who helped stop the Liberian Civil War, will be interviewed, talking about her experience of really mobilizing civil society from the bottom up in terms of demanding trust and humanity from her country. So again, thank you all very, very much for your thoughtfulness. And we look forward to our audience joining us next week.